The role of plowshares in monitoring the Canada-Israel arms trade largely deals with maintaining records of Canadian arms exports to to Israel, and this includes historical records, but also current records. So the work we do here is not unique to Israel. We do this for every country in the world. And this includes monitoring for and collecting information related to the actual transfer of military goods on a case-by-case basis. So when people hear about the arms trade, they typically think of guns and tanks and bullets and that sort of thing. So whenever Canada exports those types of weapons to another country, we maintain records on that. And that allows us to kind of paint trends and understand different arms trade relationships between Canada and the world. But our work goes deeper than that, because we're not just interested in those kind of high level full systems, we would say, again, things like tanks and fighter aircraft or anything like that. We also look a lot at the trade and transfer of components, which are all military end use as well. So these are the parts and components that comprise full systems. So speaking kind of high level here, our work on attempting to understand the Canada-Israel arms trade, a large part of it is tracking the trade and transfer of all military goods outgoing from Canada to Israel, which includes any sort of full systems. Canada doesn't actually typically export full systems to Israel, and therefore we look a lot at parts and components, which is what Canada typically transfers to Israel. A big part of what Plowshares does also, not just for Israel, but looking at all of Canada's arms exports, is to view those arms exports through the lens of Canada's obligations under its arms control regime, right? So Canada, like most countries, has to follow a series of rules and procedures when weapon systems are being transferred abroad. And typically these are, a given transfer is kind of looked against the human rights record of the potential recipient. And so in this case, when Canada does export weapon systems abroad, in particular into contexts where they could be used in human rights violations, Project Plowshares, like other civil society organizations, will bring attention to this, and will certainly challenge them where it makes sense. This has been, we've done a lot of work, for instance, on Canada's arms exports to Saudi Arabia, also Canada's arms exports to places like Turkey, and particularly since October 2023, we've done the same with Israel, raising the problematic aspects of Canada's ongoing arms exports to Israel, given the very real risk that these transfers could be used in human rights violations. Canadian authorities cannot authorize arms exports if there is a substantial risk that they could be used in violations of international humanitarian law or international human rights law, or if they could be used to facilitate other abuses. That's absolutely the case with Canada's arms exports to Israel. So part of our work here at Plowshares is raising the profile of problematic transfers and challenging them, through research and advocacy. Yeah, why is this work so important? So, Plowshares we do have a bit of a unique place in the Canadian civil society space as it relates to peace and human rights and certainly disarmament. There are excellent organizations in Canada that do some of the work that Plowshares does, but I think it is true that there's not quite one organization that does everything Plowshares does all at once. And so here I'm not just talking about the arms file. What I'm talking about is the arms file, the nuke file, space security, explosive weapons, civilian protection, and new technologies, right? So I think across the board, Plowshares plays an important role in pushing for better policy on these issue areas on the part of the government of Canada. But I think on the arms file in particular, Canada is, generally speaking, exporting more weapons abroad annually than ever before. We don't have a full picture due to a lack of transparency, but it can be said that the value of Canadian arms transfers annually over the past few years have reached a bit of a fever pitch, and a very problematic aspect of this is. In any given year, much if not most of Canada's arms exports going out, at least those that are reported by the federal government, are destined for autocratic states or states that have been accused of war crimes, including Israel. So I think the work of plowshares is important insofar that the Canadian arms trade is growing. And Canadian industry is certainly looking at selling to certain regimes that are at the very least less than democratic, if not worse. That's a diplomatic way to put it. I think that drawing attention to the risk of exporting weapons to Israel is particularly important due to the very serious humanitarian crisis happening right now in Gaza, right? So at the time that this video is being filmed, there's been more than 37,000 Palestinians killed, the vast majority civilians, tens of thousands more injured. Save the Children released a report yesterday showing that there's thousands of children that are just missing, that are just not included in these metrics that are already kind of hard to wrap your head around. So I think this work is very important, again, to challenge the export of weapon systems from Canada to Israel that could be used in some of these abuses, right? And let's be clear here. Again, Israel has openly breached international humanitarian law, the laws of war. That's not even controversial to say. Some of Israel's actions likely constitute war crimes, and the International Court of Justice has said that their actions could plausibly constitute genocide. In no case is it appropriate for the government of Canada to export weapon systems that could be used in any of these abuses. So I think that really is the crux of why this work is important. I think civil society as well plays a unique part in being almost a little bit of a sober second thought on government, right? We are not government, we are not industry, we are separate. And I think, research and advocacy from civil society is critical in pushing policies to where we want to see them. The largest push to see a more progressive and human rights focused position on arming Israel has absolutely come from civil society. Project Plowshares has worked with dozens of civil society groups on this file since October. And I think that civil society plays a critical role, in pushing Canadian policy to be more human rights focused, more justice focused. And that's why this work is critical. So it's a good question. So there's long-standing challenges with understanding the arms trade full stop, really to any destination. It's only within the past few decades that it's become more normal for major arms exporting states and kind of second tier states like Canada and thereafterwards to start proactively reporting their arms exports. This is kind of a recent phenomenon. And countries like Canada comparatively are rather transparent when you do compare ourselves to other countries. We're certainly not the best in the world. And when I say, we're doing a good job in transparency, what I am talking about is the government of Canada proactively reporting its arms exports, its transfer of controlled goods consistently. Again, there's certainly things that I think Global Affairs Canada could do better, and we've written extensively about this, but comparatively Canada does do better than other countries. That said, there are still issues that need to be tackled. Looking at looking at the available information and trying to understand what a given exporter transfers in arms to another country. You can either look at official primary records. These are records that are released by federal governments typically. In the case of Canada, it's released by Global Affairs Canada, or Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then you can look at secondary sources. So secondary sources would be things like press releases from industry, from arms manufacturers that announce arms contracts that have happened, or industry journals, industry publications that kind of write about defense, the defense sector more broadly. Things like Jane's, if you're familiar with Jane's. Those are kind of the two major tracks that kind of practitioners in this field use to understand the arms trade relationship between countries. And Israel has been a difficult country to understand, to fully get a grasp of what Canada exports to Israel. This is not a new phenomenon. Even though Canada does, although is exporting more weapons to Israel than it ever has before, in the past 10-15 years, Canada has consistently exported weapons annually to Israel. But a lot of these arms deals aren't really well understood. I think the reason for that is because most of Canada's arms exports to Israel are small transactions that relate to parts and components. We know that Canada does export components used in military aircraft to Israel, as well as components used in bombs and rockets and other munitions, as well as things like radar and goods categorized as spacecraft and any electronics. So it's kind of a potpourri of parts and components. And the issue with trying to get more information on these transfers is that not much is written about low value transfers of circuit boards and that sort of thing, because it's not particularly exciting, and to many it doesn't seem particularly problematic, until you realize that these components enable the use of larger full systems, again, things like fighter aircraft. So in understanding the Canada-Israel arms trade, that's certainly been an issue. That the structure of the Canada-Israel arms trade is really comprised of small bits of components. An additional issue that we've faced, and again, this is not unique to Israel, is that Canada does not report most of its arms exports to the United States. And the U.S. is well known to be the biggest provider of military aid to Israel. We've written about this, the fact that there is Canadian-made components that are being exported to the U.S. first, and then afterwards to Israel. We believe some of these have actually been used in the ongoing operation in Gaza. But from a primary source perspective, these are not reported by the government of Canada because there's transparency and regulatory loopholes afforded to transfers that go through the U.S. So that's all to say, we know that the value of the Canada-Israel arms trade is growing as per what is reported by the government of Canada. We don't have a full picture, however, because some of these exports are going through the United States, and the exports that are reported by the government of Canada that we try to get more information on, it's difficult to get information on because these are small pieces of equipment. So historically, Israel has not been a major destination for Canadian weapon systems. The biggest suppliers to Israel, again, countries like the United States, far outpace the value of Canadian arms exports to Israel. And the value of Canadian arms exports annually to Israel, they have gone up and down. There was a period in the late 1980s where they actually dropped to zero. And this was during a period when the government of Canada basically stopped arms exports to most countries in the Middle East due to concerns around human rights. More recently, though, again, as noted, the value of Canadian arms exports to Israel have been increasing. kind of generally year over year. There's some deviations there, but it's fair to say that in any given year over the past few years, the total value of Canadian arms exports to Israel is much larger than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. As per data that was released just a few weeks ago, last year Canada actually exported more weapon systems to Israel than ever before. So what we are seeing is, as the situation in the Middle East becomes increasingly or less and less stable, the appetite within Israel for Western weapons seems to be increasing, and Canada is filling some of that void, right? So again, as the situation basically worsens in the Middle East, we're seeing an increase in Canadian arms exports to Israel, which is problematic. Yeah, so we released a report called "Fanning the Flames" in mid-December on essentially everything that we knew about the Canada-Israel arms trade. At least Canada's export of weapon systems to Israel, and it included commentary on, for instance, Canadian-made components that are used in the F-35 Lightning II Joint Strike Fighter, which are exported to the U.S. and thereafterwards are utilized in Israeli F-35s, which we know have been used in the bombardment of Gaza. So a number of things have happened since then. We discovered through the work of a publication called The Maple that Canada had actually authorized, Canadian officials had authorized nearly $30 million worth of arms exports to Israel between October 7th and early December. So we learned, another way to put it, that in the days after the October 7th attacks and Israel's response, Canadian arms exports increased. And they increased despite there very clearly being human rights risks, certainly in the opening days of the conflict, the opening days of the operation. And then, these concerns really materialized when we started seeing the huge civilian cost of the Israeli operation. But despite those concerns, we saw Canadian arms exports being authorized, at a pace, at a furious pace. Thereafterwards, in March, there was an opposition motion that was sponsored by the New Democratic Party that was introduced into Parliament that called for, amongst other things, a cessation of arms exports to Israel, and it called for all already existing arms export permits to be revoked. So it essentially called for a full revocation of all exports and export authorizations to Israel for military goods, due to the concerns that they could be used in human rights violations. That motion ended up passing. So a majority of members of Parliament endorsed the motion, including Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Foreign Minister Melanie Joly, and so really the government of Canada now endorsed this motion that said that they were going to stop arms exports to Israel. The motion was heavily amended. Certainly, it was, some would say, watered down with what it called for, but in its final language, it was quite clear that Canada had to stop sending arms to Israel. That motion was walked back within 24 hours of it being passed in this kind of late night vote. And so what we understand now to be the policy is that the government of Canada is no longer going to authorize future arms exports to Israel, but all previously authorized arms export permits are going to be allowed to be shipped against. So for all intents and purposes, Canada is continuing to arm Israel, as far as we understand, but they are not currently authorizing new export permits. I think a critical thing to remember here is that, as I was just mentioning, in the 2 months just after the the onset of the operation, Canada authorized $30 million worth of arms exports to Israel. Most of these are things, again, like circuit boards that are used in military aircraft. Or that's one example of the types of goods that were authorized, and all of this technology is now, allowed to be exported to Israel. So that's absolutely a problematic thing that Project Plowshares has called for reversal in this policy on the part of the government of Canada, but that was another thing that's happened since. Certainly too, in starting in the new year, it seemed like there was there really has been a groundswell of civil society organizing around the issue of Canada's arms exports to Israel. I think it's fair to say that certainly in the last few years, I can't think of an example where so many civil society groups came together around the same issue so quickly. And we're talking about, from the major civil society humanitarian organizations that you could walk down the street and anyone would know, to the very grassroots organizations that are doing, really like community driven organizing. And it's really been a pleasure to see this kind of coalesce. So there's been a number of civil society initiatives. There's been a number of open letters that have been written to ministers calling for, everything from an end to Canada's arms exports to Israel, to greater transparency around certain issues, to more particular issues related to the conflict itself, calling for a ceasefire, etc. And then further to that, there's been Project Plowshares hasn't engaged with all of this, but there's certainly been major, again, grassroots organizing days of action. There was a major 2A embargo day of action just recently, which saw a host of actions across the country. Yeah.